Micah 6, starting in verse 1. We'll read to verse 8. Listen to what the Lord says. Stand up. Plead your case before the mountains. Let the hills hear what you have to say. Hear, O mountains, the Lord's accusation. Listen, you everlasting foundations of the earth. For the Lord has a case against his people. He is lodging a charge against Israel. My people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? Answer me. I brought you up out of Egypt. I redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam. My people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, counseled, and what Balaam, son of Beor, answered. Remember your journey from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has showed you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. There's really one word that stands out to me in this text this morning. It's not by any means the most important word of the text. It's also not the only word in the text or the only thing that could be said. It just simply is the thing that has stood out and caught my attention this week. It comes from that final verse, verse 8, the one that's probably most familiar to us. Even if you didn't know that Micah wrote these words, you've probably heard them before. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. The word from that phrase that captures my attention is the word justice. I believe it's the answer to the question, not the only answer, but a very good answer to the question, what is it that's at the heart of God? Justice is what's expected of God's people, not only to know about it, but also to work for it. And that's the problem we're finding here in the book of Micah. God's people have forgotten the heart of God. They have forgotten what it means to be God's people, and they have forgotten their task as God's people. They've forgotten to do justice. Micah sees it. You and I would like Micah. He's a country boy. I spent some time visiting with Ernie and Kim in the hospital this week in Sugar Land, and as we were sitting there talking, one of the nurses walked in and she looked at us and she said, "So where are y'all from?" And Ernie answers and says, "Well, we're from Eagle Lake." It was quickly and it was very clear that the nurse had no idea where Eagle Lake was located. And so Ernie helped her out and said, It's out in the country. We're country folk. So is Micah. Micah's country folk. He lives approximately 25 miles southwest of Jerusalem, the big city, which is where all the injustice is coming from. He sees that God's people have forgotten again what stirs the heart of God. And instead of being those who work for justice, God's people have become the ones who are promoting and advancing injustice. They've taken advantage of the less fortunate. They've bribed them and they have stolen from them. And then if the less fortunate then put up any kind of opposition whatsoever, they are prone at times to go to resort to violence in order to get their ways. Injustice is moving. Micah sees it, but he's not the only one who sees what's going on. So is God. And that's what the book of Micah is all about. You see, God has come close to deal with the injustice that is taking place. If we were to flip to chapter 1 and read verse 3, it begins there. And I love this imagery. And I want to encourage you, as I've done so many times, especially when you're reading the prophets, don't just read the words. Sit back and take in the pictures that are being painted for you. Chapter 1 says this, "For behold, the Lord is coming out of his place." He's leaving where he usually sits. He will come down and tread upon the high places of the earth. And then Micah goes on to talk about as he treads, things start to split apart and things start to melt. Things are happening. Things are moving. And the prophet Micah is helping us not only to read that, but he wants us to see it and feel it and hear it and all those kinds of things. Short and sweet, God's making a personal visit. And he hasn't come to bring pleasantries. God's fed up. It's pretty clear throughout this book. Not necessarily with the people, although he is with the people, but his reaction and his fed upness, if we should say, is more upon the actions of the people. And again, this isn't a generic thing that is being said by Micah. He's not speaking, or his book is not written to the entirety of the world. What we have to recognize when we come to the prophets is that most of the time, if not all of the time, I'm just always scared to say all of the time, he is speaking, or the prophet is speaking very specifically to those people who have entered into a covenant relationship with God. In fact, those 3 words that we read in chapter 8 are every much a part of covenant wording. Micah is writing this book to God's people, those who have entered into that covenant, those who have promised to make their heart the very heart of God, who promised to be stirred by the same desires that stir God, yet now they have cast those things aside. They no longer share the heart of God. And that brings us to chapter 6. It's a courtroom scene really like none other. God in his grace is actually allowing Israel to plead their case in this chapter. And this is what impresses me. The jury is made up of the hills, the mountains, and the everlasting foundations of the earth. Talk about nowhere to go and run and hide. It's pretty cool imagery, and it kind of reminds me of one of those intervention shows that used to be on where, the whole family gathers together and you're surprised by all who is sitting around there because they have something they need to say. Here's the cool part. Again, here's the grace in this passage. You see, God has all authority just to simply pass judgment on Israel. But instead, he gives Israel a fair hearing. God allows Israel to plead their case. Have you ever really considered the significance of this, even in our own lives? That the sovereign God listens. Even when we are totally in the wrong, the sovereign God remains fair. The God who is fair and who listens gives Israel a chance to plead their case before the hills and the mountains and the everlasting foundations of the earth. Then God speaks. It's appropriate maybe to think that he's angry, and I would bet that anger plays a part in what is taking place. Again, anger rightly bounded is not something that is bad or evil or something that we should be afraid of. But what seems to be God's primary motivation in this text and in the things that he is saying right now in Micah 6 is grief. God recounts all of the places that he and Israel have been together. All of the times God has rescued them and all of the times that God has protected them. This is grief making its way into words. And we need not be afraid of the biblical authors communicating emotion, especially when they speak of and about God. This is faithfulness that is so vulnerable, being put on display, that we know there will never be a time when God will abandon his covenant partner. God demonstrates his grief in the fact that his covenant people have strayed so far away from the heart that he is trying to give to him. This is grief making its way into words. As God writes, look at all the places that I have taken you. Don't forget Moses and Miriam and Aaron, and don't forget the rescue that I had with Egypt. And as he begins to rattle off this list for all of them to see, he is not communicating his resume. I've been around those kinds of people. People that want to win you over because of all that they've done, or they want you to decide for them because of all that they've done. And if you don't decide the way they want, then they'll take all of their support away from you. That's not what God is doing. Again, God is communicating faithfulness, and we need to listen, because it will be the same faithfulness that will make hope possible in this book. Something else Micah communicates in and throughout the book. Israel now speaks. What do you want from us? Israel says. It begins in verse 6. You want more sacrifice? Do you want bigger sacrifice from us? Do you want grander gestures? Is that what you're looking for from us, God? I mean, read their list. It's fairly ridiculous. It starts out somewhat okay. Do you want a burnt offering that is perfect? And then it moves, do you want thousands of rams, which in reality nobody can do? Solomon might have done it once, but it's overwhelming. Or how about tens of thousands of rivers of oil? Again, no one can bring these things before God. And then it goes on to the point of complete ridiculousness. You want our firstborn? Is that what you're looking for? It's not in the text, but it's as if God whispers, you really don't get it. Israel, you've missed the point. This isn't my heart. It never was what I'd fully wanted or desired from you. Sacrifice and discipline are a problem for every generation, because these things are measurable. And there's nothing wrong with them. We're encouraged to take part in them. But sacrifice and ritual are supposed to take us somewhere. They're supposed to form our heart into the heart of God's. My son is brilliant with the words, yes, sir. He's very good at them. He says them with ease, and he says them with great conviction whenever he says them. And he's even mastered the right time and the right places in which to offer up these simple little words of, yes, sir. And I'm grateful, but his words alone do not form his heart. That is our challenge. He often says them just to appease me, instead of thinking through what it is that they mean or what it is that I'm honestly desiring from him. Instead of allowing them to be a vehicle into a new way of life where his heart is formed in a new and a more profound way. The Israelites went to church more times than we could probably count. They gave much and they gave often. They even taught advanced Bible studies. But their hearts were not being formed anymore. They were missing the connection between sacrifice and a life and the life that it was calling them to embrace. God is forming our hearts. That's why we come here. We don't come just to sing, but we allow our hearts to fall more in love with the one who gave us life in the first place. And we come here not just to fellowship with one another, but to take part in the community in which God has called together. This community that now more purposefully defines us than anything else in our lives. We come here to practice. We come here to learn. We come here so that our hearts may be stirred into the affections of God Almighty. These disciplines do at least two things for us. When we come and when we do them, they remind us of what is important to God, and then they open us up to the opportunity to serve both God and others. Jesus puts this on display often in the Gospels. He illustrates it in many of the parables that he tells. Jennifer illustrated it in the story that she read to you out of Matthew 25, and all the people come to them and say, but we did all of these things. And Jesus says, but when you saw those who were hungry, you did not feed them. Jesus isn't talking about literally that you didn't just give them a piece of bread. What he is saying is that you did not allow me to form my heart in you. You did not allow me to move you into a place where your affections, your loves, and your desires are changed. It happens again in the Good Samaritan. You know the story well. It's why I use it. A man is beaten up and left for dead by robbers. Two religious people come by, a priest and a Levite, and they squander on by. They know everything about the law. They've probably have more ritual and more disciplines than I could ever even begin to imagine. But their hearts were turned far away from justice and from the very thing that God desired most of them. They had all the practices in the world, but they didn't allow those practices to move them into a new place where God was forming them into His character and into His image. The third man comes along. I don't know what his religious background was per se, but I would imagine he had some, but the change is obvious. He's been moved into a new way of life, to where God's heart is being formed in him, and where the only thing he can do is give up whatever he has so that he can help the gentleman who is in the ditch. God is forming our hearts. It's what salvation looks like. It's what Christ is doing in each of our hearts. Through the Spirit, God is stirring our affections for him. That's the good news. Micah 6 is a tough chapter, but it doesn't end without hope. In fact, read some of the last verses of Micah, and there's some of the most beautiful hope-oriented verses in Scripture. The faithful God always remains faithful to his work, forming the heart of his people. You see, that's what the Spirit does in our lives. Jesus teaches us what it looks like, and the Spirit then forms us so that we can daily take on more of that image. God is faithful, and his work in our lives and our community is evident. Jen shared with us about a summer lunch program. She shared with you not only her heart and her affections being stirred in a very new way that was informed by her practices and by her faith and by her disciplines. She shared with you those two ladies who were praying and didn't know they were praying, but they were praying about the same time, about doing the same thing, and yet God was stirring their affections and was stirring their heart beyond just the disciplines that they had found in their lives to move out and to perform justice. Isaiah gives us a beautiful image of justice, and one of the images that he gives us is he says to take care of the poor, to take care of those who have little. The food pantry that we house at our church is another way in which we are enacting justice, the way in which we are participating in what it means to bring about God's justice, not only in our community, but in the lives of the individuals that we serve in this community. You see, God has come on behalf of those, and we take part in distributing what it is that God has. What's on God's heart? What is it to get at the heart of God? Was justice. It's to do justice. And the good news is the justice that we learn about, especially in the life of Christ, is not retributive justice, where God is getting even with us, but it's restorative justice, where God is overcoming all barriers that lie in the way of our relationship with him. We don't overcome those things. He does. And he calls us to himself. You see, that's what Jesus did. We're going to study Matthew a little bit here in the next few weeks, several weeks. And one of the things that Matthew helps us to understand is that Jubilee has come. All debts canceled, all sins forgiven. All those things that stood in the way of any kind of a relationship we have with God, canceled. That's God's kind of justice. It's restorative. It's learning and recognizing what stands in between us or a culture or another people, and it's finding ways in which we may, piece by piece, attack those things. What the prophets do for us is they reorient us and they help us to see in a new way. Sin was the thing that reigned in our lives before Christ. But because of his death, because of his resurrection, God has brought justice into the world. And because of that justice, that relationship that we once could not have has been restored for those who will accept it by faith. One last thing as I close out this text. Justice can often be difficult for those who have experienced injustice. They're in the text. You see, they're not mentioned so much in chapter 6, but they're mentioned throughout Micah. There are those who are suffering under the weight of the injustice of this culture. There are those who cry out, it's not fair, and they're right. There are those who have experienced things in such ways that they wonder if they ever can get rightfully heard or if anything in their lives will ever rightfully be put back together. Injustice is very devastating and it is very damaging. God has come on behalf of those. God sees you. God knows your pain. And more importantly, what Micah is trying to help us to understand is God is at work on your behalf. Sometimes the only anchor we have as a Christian community is hope. But I want you to hear me. Hope holds. because of the one who is at work in our lives. The easiest thing to do is to grow cynical. And I say that because that is a personal struggle that I have. I understand cynicism from a very personal spot in my life. I look at things often from the standpoint of it's never going to get better, it's never going to get fixed, and cynicism goes well beyond that. The hardest thing to do when the only thing you have to hold on to is the easiest thing to do when all you have to hold on to is hope, is to become cynical about the world. Please fight that. These disciplines that God has called us into, like worship and like being a part of the community, is to help remind us that God is at work, that God remains faithful, that God listens, that God sees, and that hope is a reality because of Christ. What's at the heart of God? Justice. It's what He worked for each and every one of us through Christ. And it's the thing that He asks for us as the church to make sure that we are about in the world. God is forming us into His image. And as He's forming us into His image, He is placing on our hearts the very things that stir His affections. He'll keep doing it. He's already doing it, as has been evidenced in our service today. And I look forward to seeing the places where God is going to continue to call us out, delivering hope to others and bringing about justice, His kind of justice in this world. Let's pray.